Hi everyone, this is lecture 4 for California Labor, Race, Gender, and Work. In this lecture, we are going to round out some of the foundational concepts and definitions that will be the foundation for a lot of the work and readings that you will do for the remainder of the semester. So it's really important that as we go through these different definitions and concepts, that if you're confused or need clarification, that you email or post a question on our discussion board so that I can clarify it as needed. As I noted, we'll be talking about gender, race, pay gaps, and why race and gender continue to matter. So what you'll find is that these are some of the central concepts, at least particularly race and gender, that were talked about in both the Nakano Glen readings as in the first week, as well as the Gary Okihiro reading for this week. All you have to do is pick up a newspaper or do a quick net search, because I know most of us don't pick up newspapers anymore and read our stuff online, and you'll find any number of different articles regarding race in the workforce or gender in the workforce. For example, just doing a quick search, we'll see something that says the Latino wage gap larger in Texas than the rest of the United States. That was run in the Houston Chronicle in June of 2009. Or pay gap persists for African Americans, according to CNN Money, July 2010. Or even more recently, as of June 2012, women earn 77.4 cents for every dollar that men earn. And this was very widely broadcast and written about based on a study done by the National Committee on Pay Equity. But the bottom line is that you don't really have to look very hard to continue to see these different types of pay gaps that still that come up in media. And yet at the same time, the fact that this isn't a new, even though this isn't a new story, it's a persistent one, it's often treated with surprise. And so part of what we want to really think about is, why are these types of news articles or headlines a surprise to us? So in order to really begin to understand that, we really need to set the foundation for some key definitions around race and gender, and then also talk about pay gaps, and then also look at what inequality and disparity looks like. First, I think it's really important to delineate the difference between sex and gender. Again, as I noted in our very first lecture as a sociologist, we look at the social construction of meaning around categories. Now, sex refers specifically to the biological term that's ascribed to genetic, anatomical, and hormonal differences between males and females. When you think about the term sex, that really you want to think about the fact that when a woman gives birth, the doctor says, guess what? It's a boy. And they basically, or guess what? It's a girl, based on what they're seeing in terms of genitalia. The determination is made through the application of socially agreed upon biological criteria for classifying persons as females or males. So here we're talking about an ascribed characteristic. Gender, however, is basically going back to that idea of social construction that we're talking about, the meanings that we attach to terms. So this is a society's notions of masculinity and femininity, socially constructed meanings associated with male or female, and how individuals construct their gender identity within these constraints. It helps determine quote-unquote proper behaviors and placement in the stratification system, and individuals are expected to act appropriately for their sex category. So an example that I often use is, when we're growing up, we hear things like, boys don't cry, or little girls don't roll around the mud and play that way. And while a lot of things have changed, you can think of any number of types of stereotypes that we hear, the ways, and we're socialized into thinking that this is an appropriate behavior for a little boy, this is an appropriate behavior for a little girl, or this is an appropriate way to dress, and this is an appropriate way not to dress. So all you have to do is go to your local Little League and see how it plays out, right? Or it's even the idea of what sports little girls and little boys can play. So anyways, it's these different notions that we attach these notions of masculinity and femininity that we attach to being male or female. So again, to remind you, we went through this in the very first lecture. Social constructionism basically refers to attaching meanings or connecting meanings to categories such as race, class, gender, and citizenship. And here I was just talking about the social construction of gender, the meanings that we attach to what it means to be male and the meanings that we attach to being female. We also, when we think about these things, we would also call them gender roles. Those are commonly assigned tasks or expected behaviors of individuals because of their sex category. Roles are rationalized by the idea that men are men and women are women, a division that is perceived to be natural or rooted in biology. In other words, that these roles can only be played out by men and women. Well, how that pertains to work is that we attach gendered meanings to particular types of work. So we know that, for example, in public service, like with police officers and firefighters, historically women were not seen as being able to do this work. It was men's work. And there were any number of social constructed meanings around why women couldn't do the work, whether it was true or not, whether it was being able to lift and rescue people, whether they were able to actually deal with conflict, that supposedly women were too emotional to do these jobs. Conversely, we could think about nurses. Women were nurses and men were doctors. And so when you saw men become nurses, they were often teased or ridiculed because this was seen as women's work. We could say the same thing about janitorial work or maid work or babysitting and daycare, that many of these things were constructed as women's work. And so, and we see that going beyond the sort of formal workforce and industry. We also know that that's also how meanings and categories were attached to the home. That there was a particular area of the house, like the kitchen, that was for women, and the garage was of course for men. Now, again, when we talk about social constructions, these are meanings that we attach to categories, whether they are true or not. We take them as common sense understandings and perceive them to be true, even if in fact they are not. Now it's equally important for us to lay down a foundational definition for race. It refers to differences in human physical characteristics used to categorize large numbers of people. The differences and similarities between the categories and groups are deemed to be socially significant and as a rationale for treating groups differently from one another. Here it is really important to note that race is not the same as ethnicity. Ethnicity refers to groupings and categories that are traditionally linked to a particular nation, a particular culture, and can be traced back to particular roots in a particular country of origin. Race, on the other hand, are large categories that can encompass multiple ethnic groups. Even if they don't get along historically, even if they don't speak the same language, they are all assumed to be the same. Case in point, one racial category that is commonly used is Asian, despite the fact that there are 42 different Asiatic countries with distinct histories, distinct cultures that go back for over 4,000 years, histories of warring against one another and having large political rifts between them at different moments of time. Some were kingdoms or colonized by other Asiatic countries, and yet they're all considered under one category. They're Asian. So when we think about these categories and groups, we also know that race takes on very specific meanings, and we use these different categories to create a hierarchy. We do this through a process of racialization. It's the process by which understandings of race are used to classify individuals or groups of people. Racial distinctions are more than ways of describing human differences. They're also important factors in the reproductions of patterns of inequality. Now, here I think it's really important to note that when we talk about understandings of race are used to classify individuals or groups of people, we've seen, for example, with African Americans, that they have often been seen as having a very low status in U.S. society, because uh, historically they've come up with numerous quote unquote scientific explanations, assuming that uh, using things like cranium size or cranium measurements as a way to, or as a way to describe why one group was inferior or one was superior. Um, these types of metrics we've been found to be completely untrue, but it's a process by which people assume inferiority or superiority. They use categories like Asians as the model minority. Look that they've made it. This whole group has made it as a way to create separation between groups. So this process of racialization is used to attach meanings to different racial categories. So a racial project is simultaneously an interpretation, representation, or explanation of racial dynamics in an effort to reorganize and redistribute resources along particular racial lines. So this is sort of a complicated term, and this was first introduced by Michael Omi and Howard Winott. And basically, what we begin to understand is that through different types of media representations, the ways in which we portray particular racial groups, we allocate particular resources to them, whether that is money, education, um, over policing, whatever it may be, is that what we do is we create a hierarchy by which we rank or create a stratified grouping. Um, Racial projects connect what race means to particular discursive practice and the ways in which both social structures and everyday experiences are organized based upon that meaning. So, as I've noted before, it's about, one of the examples I've used in terms of race is the criminal justice system. One of the things that criminologists have proven over and over again in their studies is that African Americans and Latinos, in particular African American men and Latino men, are incarcerated at much higher rates. Their neighborhoods are policed at higher levels, and their ability to get proper representation has led to higher incarceration rates, even when compared for similar types of crimes with their white male counterparts. Michelle Alexander has done an amazing study called The New Jim Crow, which highlights the ways in which this racial disparity is particularly important to look at for Latinos and African Americans. And I've provided an optional link that you can look at where she discusses incarceration. But here, what we begin to understand is because of the assumption of guilt, because of the assumption of criminality, we allocate a lot of policing resources to these groups. And as such, it leads to higher levels of incarceration, as you'll see in some of the graphs later on. So, when we think about these social constructions or these racial projects where we attach meanings to particular categories, how we think about this, what we begin to see is that we attach racial meanings to particular types of work. And these are things that you should think about in your readings for this semester. Who do we assume are fast food and restaurant workers? Who do we assume are agricultural workers? Who do we assume are always the professional sports stars? Who do we assume are maids and housekeepers as opposed to managers and professionals? And in our minds, we see this portrayed every day in the media. We know that agricultural work is disproportionately portrayed as Mexican or Latino, but a very specific Mexican and Latino. There's this assumption of being quote unquote illegal. When we think about professional sports stars, particularly around basketball and football, we often think about African Americans. For maids and housekeepers, increasingly, again, people of color, but again, that can be geographically driven. Latinos and African Americans, depending on where you're at. And in terms of managers and professionals, disproportionately, we think about white males in those particular roles. So, part of what we want to think about as you're doing your reading is what racial meanings are we attaching to the type of work that we're reading about? And how does this impact the everyday experiences of these workers? Now, I know I've gone rather quickly between this discussion of race on race and gender, But I also know that these theoretical terms that I'm going through rather quickly are much easier to talk about when we're applying them to our reading. So take this as an introduction to the theories, take this as an introduction to the concepts, and know that most of the rest of this course, after these first 2 weeks of lectures, are very focused on applying these concepts. So again, try to understand it, take note of these particular concepts, and if you need more clarification, then certainly ask questions. Now, part of what we study when we talk about labor is understanding what pay gaps are. Because at the end of the day, part of what we want to know is what does inequality look like based on race and based on gender. First, we need to understand what a pay gap is. A pay gap is the percentage difference in earnings between two groups, right? So that's women and men, uh, Asians and whites, et cetera, right? So the percentage difference in earnings between two groups. So in this first pay gap slide, this was taken basically using Bureau of Labor Statistics current population survey data, in other words, federal data. What we can see here is that there are huge, that when compared to white males, almost every other group, with the exception of Asian males, makes significantly less. Asian females make 22% less, black females 54% less, Hispanic males 55% less, Hispanic females 73% less. So for every dollar, right, a Hispanic female will make, for every dollar a white male makes, a Hispanic female would make 27 cents. This is how we read this graph. We understand that this is a huge percentage difference, right? This data is all aggregated. It doesn't control for particular industries, but this, again, gives us a snapshot of what we're seeing for each particular group. Note that even for white females, they're making 76 cents on the dollar to their white male counterparts. Earning ratios. It measures the earnings of one group as a fraction of the earnings of another group. Here you're pretty much going to see the same thing we saw in the other slides. Greater disparities, with the exception of Asian males, across the board. Now, what's interesting particularly about the Asian male numbers is if actually you were to disaggregate that out of a racial group and actually control for which ethnic group, you would actually see two different stories based on immigrant generation, with third, fourth generation, particularly Chinese and Japanese, those numbers staying very true to that particular earnings ratio. And if you look at Thai, Cambodian, Korean, etc., that it would not be this high. In fact, that they would be on the minus side relative to white males. So why are there pay gaps? And this is some of the stuff that we're going to talk about throughout the entire semester. It is a systemic issue. It doesn't just happen overnight. We begin to see pay gaps because of access to education and educational tracking. We do know studies show that particular racial groups and particular gender groups get tracked out of sciences, out of business management. That at an early age, you don't have access to the types of classes that will get you into college. The cost of college these days are all impediments to helping increase your ability to earn higher levels of pay. Particularly as it relates to gender, there's assumed time away from the workforce for women. In a survey done of managers, when asked about the pay difference between men and women, why that existed, 83% of managers said that they assumed that women would want to have children and would leave the workforce. So even if a woman decided not to have children, or even during their first 5 years, let's say, and they weren't having children, it was just assumed that they should earn lower pay because they would eventually leave the workforce. And then, of course, there's other issues such as discrimination, which happens at the micro level in terms of decisions that particular individual managers make, but discrimination that may also happen systemically, based on targeted hiring and how some groups are given privileges over others. These are all some of the systemic things that we will talk about in the course of this class. So there are numerous other reasons why race and gender matters. And I'm going to just cover a few of them more because I want to give you a snapshot of different industries that intersect the work that you may be doing when you leave college. We know that, for example, as I noted earlier, we have incarceration rates. It is very clear that Latino and African American men disproportionately are incarcerated relative to their white male counterparts. This happens for numerous reasons, and again, if this is something you're interested in, take a look at the optional link that I've put on the website in relationship to this lecture. Again, here you can look between 2000 and 2007. The different levels of incarceration, it's both raced and gendered. Again, we see black and Latino males at much higher rates, as well as white males. We see a huge differential between men and women and how they're incarcerated, but this is the snapshot here. It's a different way of displaying the same data. There's also issues around health. We know that education is linked with health, regardless of racial or ethnic group. What we do know is that the more education one has, the better their health is. In large part, this can be associated with who has access to health care, regardless of ethnicity, and that's the story that this particular slide shows. But we do know that health varies by income and across racial and ethnic groups. We know that poverty matters. We know racial groups matter, with higher levels of of health disparity, with high incidences for blacks and Latinos, as you'll see in this graph. So here we are at the end of the lecture, and part of what reason I'm showing you this map, and you'll see different maps like this throughout the semester, is that the one thing that is consistent is change. We do know across the country, looking at data from the U.S. Census from 2000 to 2010, there are huge shifts or percentage change shifts in minority populations by county. Focus here on California, right there on the left-hand side of your slide here. The greater proportion of California is showing huge amounts of change in minority demographics, especially, throughout the entire county, ranging anywhere from a 28% change to a 57% change. Right. Here we are in Southern California. We know, we see, we feel it. All you have to do is go out your front door, and you can see these changes. But what these changes also indicate are new challenges for many different arenas. New challenges in education. It means that the workforce is more diverse, but also in addition to being more diverse, it also means that minorities are going to be entering different parts of the workforce. As we'll discuss later, we'll see huge numbers of minorities going into the service sector. But we also will see that the greatest demand in some sectors for work will be around health. For example, we have large health disparities because we don't have a workforce that can actually access these communities for linguistic reasons, cultural understandings, etc. So again, the one constant is change, and here we see across the country is that we have increasing numbers of minority populations all across the board, but especially in these large gateway states and cities. So this ends the first module for us, and what you should have gathered from these first 4 lectures is a pretty solid foundation of the key terms and ideas that are going to be themes throughout the entire course. We will talk about race and gender consistently. We will talk about immigration and citizenship. I will challenge you to think beyond the common stereotypes, um, and also to think about how the work that people are doing um, is influenced by their race and gender, but also by thinking about our workforce much more from a much more diverse set of perspectives. How does this help us understand or rethink about the history of the United States?